My father spent 17 years building something everyone laughed at. I laughed too. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest, I was one of them. I stood in the driveway with my cousin Marcus at 14 years old and called it Dad's Apocalypse Fantasy, while he hauled another load of canned goods down those concrete steps. My mother divorced him over it. Not directly, not on paper, but the bunker was the crack that split everything else wide open. She said he loved that hole in the ground more than he loved his family. I didn't argue with her. I was 16 then, and I chose her side because choosing his meant admitting something about the world that I wasn't ready to accept. The bunker sat beneath our property in Colton, Oregon, 40 minutes from anything resembling a city. My father, Richard Voss, was a structural engineer who worked for the county for 23 years. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He didn't wear tinfoil or rant about government plots. He read infrastructure reports. He studied supply chain vulnerabilities. He watched how thin the margins were between civilization and collapse. And he decided, quietly, to prepare. The neighbors called him Doomsday Dick. My Uncle Frank made jokes at every Thanksgiving. My sister Lena refused to bring her boyfriend to the house because she didn't want him to see the ventilation shaft my father had installed beside the garden shed. I'm telling you this from inside that bunker. Day 19. The ventilation system hums above me with a steadiness that feels like my father's heartbeat. Calm, engineered, reliable. There are 9 of us down here. 3 weeks ago, there were 6 billion people on the surface living normal lives. Now the surface belongs to something else. It started in Kuala Lumpur. That's what the early reports said, though later it became clear the outbreaks were simultaneous across at least 4 continents. I was working at a civil engineering firm in Portland when my coworker Diane showed me a video on her phone during lunch. A man on a street in Malaysia, shirtless, attacking a woman outside a market stall. His movements were wrong, jerking, mechanical, like a marionette operated by someone who'd never seen a human walk. The woman screamed for 11 seconds before he found her throat. Diane laughed nervously and said it was probably a movie promotion. I agreed because agreeing was easier. By that evening, there were 40 videos. By midnight, there were thousands. I called my father at 6 a.m. the next morning. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept. "You watching the news?" I asked. His voice was flat and focused, the same tone he used when he was running calculations. "Come home, Eli. Bring whoever you trust. You have maybe 36 hours before the highways become impassable." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, that the government would contain it, that this was regional, manageable, temporary. But I'd seen 17 videos by then that showed me what Humanelli looked like when they stopped being human. "How many can the bunker hold?" I asked. "Comfortably? 8? Survivably? 12. I built it for 10. I drove to Portland and collected my sister Lena first. She lived in a studio apartment near Hawthorne with her partner Joyce. Lena answered the door in pajamas, confused, half asleep. "Eli, it's 6:30 in the morning." I told her what was happening. I showed her my phone. She watched a clip from Seoul, a crowd of them moving through a subway station in a wave, passengers scrambling over turnstiles. And then the screaming started. Lena's face went white. She didn't ask questions after that. She packed in 4 minutes. Joyce packed in 3. We drove east toward Colton. The highways were still clear. Most people hadn't accepted it yet. The radio oscillated between emergency broadcasts and DJs making nervous jokes. "Zombie apocalypse, folks. Finally, an excuse to call in sick, one said. Lena sat in the back seat with her hand over her mouth, staring at her phone. Joyce held her other hand and said nothing. I drove 8 miles over the speed limit because something in my chest told me that every minute mattered. I was right. We reached Colton by 9 a.m. The town looked normal, eerily, insultingly normal. Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden. The Okafor kids were riding bikes in their cul-de-sac. The sky was blue and unconcerned. I pulled into my father's driveway and saw him standing beside the bulkhead doors that led underground. He wore his work boots and a flannel shirt, and he looked exactly like he always had. Steady, patient, unremarkable. Except his eyes. His eyes moved across the tree line behind the property with a vigilance I'd never seen in peacetime. "You made good time," he said. "No embrace, no told you so." He looked at Lena and Joyce, nodded once and gestured toward the open bulkhead. "Put your bags inside. I'll show you the layout after everyone arrives." "Everyone?" Lena asked. "I called a few people, the ones I thought would listen." By noon, 2 more arrived. The first was Tom Adler, my father's former colleague from the county engineering office, a quiet, methodical man in his 50s who'd helped design the bunker's water filtration system. He arrived alone with a duffel bag and a case of antibiotics he'd bought from a veterinary supply website 3 years earlier. The second was Sandra Okafor from across the street. She came with her 12-year-old son, Devin. She'd seen the videos that morning. She'd watched the press conference where the CDC spokesperson's hands trembled so badly he couldn't hold his papers straight. She knocked on my father's door and said, "Richard, I never should have laughed. Please let us in." My father didn't hesitate. "Get whatever you need from your house. You have until tonight." That's when I saw the first one. Not on a screen, in person. It was 2:47 p.m., and I was helping Tom unload supplies from his truck. Movement at the edge of the road caught my eye. A man was walking along the shoulder, if you could call it walking. His left leg dragged behind him at an angle that meant his hip was dislocated or shattered. His shirt was dark with something wet. He moved with that same marionette stagger I'd seen in the Malaysian video. But in person, the wrongness was magnified 100-fold. The human brain recognizes human movement instinctively. We are hardwired for it. And when something wearing a human body moves in a way that violates every pattern your brain expects, the fear is not intellectual. It's cellular. "Dad," I said. My voice came out thin. My father was already watching. He stood on the porch with his hand on the doorframe, perfectly still. "That's Carl Whitmore," he said. "He lives on Route 7. He said it with a tone of identification, not recognition, as if naming a specimen, not a neighbor. Carl Whitmore stumbled off the road into the Pattersons' yard. Mrs. Patterson had gone inside by then. Carl walked into her fence, pressed against it, didn't stop pressing. The wood cracked. He pushed through like it wasn't there. "Everyone inside," my father said. "Now." Tom dropped the box he was holding. I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the bulkhead. Lena was already at the entrance, holding the steel door open, her face a mask of controlled terror. We filed down the concrete steps, all 7 of us, and my father came last. He sealed the bulkhead with a hydraulic mechanism he'd installed himself. 3 steel bolts slid into reinforced brackets. The door was rated for 800 pounds of lateral force. We stood in the entrance corridor, breathing hard in the fluorescent light. Devin was crying softly. Sandra held him against her chest, her hand covering his ear as if she could block out what he'd already seen. My father moved past us toward the main living area. "I'll give the tour now," he said. "Pay attention. Everything down here has a purpose, and everything has a protocol." Nobody laughed. Not anymore. The bunker was 900 square feet of organized survival. My father had divided it into sections. With the precision of a man who understood that space was a resource equal to food or water. I followed him through the corridor, and for the first time in 17 years, I saw what obsession looked like when it was vindicated. The main chambers served as living quarters and common area. 4 bunk beds along the far wall, a foldable table in the center, storage cabinets built into every available vertical surface. The ceilings were 8 feet, which my father explained was deliberate. Lower ceilings create claustrophobia faster. 8 feet gives the brain enough overhead space to delay psychological compression. He'd thought about everything, not just survival, sanity. Beyond the main chamber, a supply room stacked floor to ceiling with canned goods, freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, medical supplies, batteries, hand-crank radios, and paper, reams of it, alongside pens, pencils, and 3 decks of playing cards. "Boredom kills morale faster than hunger," my father said, gesturing at a shelf of books. "And dead morale kills groups faster than anything outside." The water system drew from a deep well my father had drilled 8 years ago, filtered through a 3-stage purification setup. The ventilation pulled air through HEPA filters and could be sealed entirely for up to 6 hours if surface contamination was detected. A composting toilet system handled waste. A small generator provided backup power, fueled by a propane reserve that my father estimated would last 4 months with conservative use. Solar-charged batteries handled the primary load. "How long can we stay down here?" Joyce asked. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of gratitude and dread. "With 9 people, assuming a 9th arrives, approximately 8 months on current supplies, longer if we ration from the start." "A 9th?" I asked. My father checked his watch. "I called your Uncle Frank this morning. He didn't believe me, but he said he'd come by this evening." He paused. "If he comes." Uncle Frank, the man who'd coined Doomsday Dick. The man who'd bought my father a tinfoil hat as a birthday gift 3 years running. I felt something complicated move through my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something uncomfortable. Frank arrived at 6:14 p.m. We heard his truck in the driveway through the external microphone system my father had wired to the surface. The camera feed showed him stepping out, looking around nervously, then practically running to the bulkhead. My father opened the door remotely. Frank came down those stairs 2 at a time, his face flushed, his breathing ragged. "There are 5 of them on Route 12, he said. 5 that I saw, they were—" He stopped, swallowed, looked at my father. "Richard, I'm sorry." My father nodded once. "Bunk 6 is yours. Put your things away. Dinner is at 7. That was it. No lecture, no vindication speech. My father simply moved to the next task, sealing the external cameras, activating the perimeter motion sensors, logging Frank's supplies into the inventory system he'd created on laminated spreadsheets. I watched him work, and I understood something I should have understood years earlier. My father hadn't built this bunker because he wanted to be right. He'd built it because he loved us more than he loved our opinion of him. Dinner that first night was canned chili and reconstituted rice. We ate around the foldable table, 9 people in a space designed for 10, which felt like breathing room. Frank sat at the end, quiet and chastened. Devin asked his mother if they could go home tomorrow. Sandra said, "We'll see, baby." Tom Adler ate methodically and said nothing. Joyce and Lena sat pressed together, their shoulders touching, drawing comfort from proximity. My father ate last. He always did. I remembered that from childhood. He'd wait until everyone else had food before serving himself. I'd interpreted it as indifference when I was young. Now I recognized it as guardianship. After dinner, he turned on the hand-crank radio. We gathered around it like families in the 1940s, faces drawn toward the small speaker. The emergency broadcast system cycled through automated messages. Shelter in place, avoid contact with symptomatic individuals, await further instructions. Between the automated loops, a human voice broke through once. A woman, maybe a local operator. If anyone can hear this in the Willamette Valley corridor, the National Guard has established a perimeter at... Static consumed the rest. My father turned the radio off. "We don't need them," he said. "We have everything we need." By day 3, the surface cameras showed us what Colton had become. The Pattersons' house was dark. No movement inside, no lights. 2 of the infected wandered their backyard in endless, purposeless loops, bumping into the fence, turning, walking, bumping again. The Okafor house across the street had a broken front window. A dark stain ran down the porch steps. Sandra saw it on the monitor and left the room without speaking. Devin wasn't allowed near the screens after that. The motion sensors triggered 18 times in the first 72 hours. Most were animals. Deer, raccoons, a neighbor's dog that paced our perimeter for hours before wandering off. But 4 of those triggers were them. The infected moved differently at night, faster, less impeded by whatever neurological damage made them stumble during daylight. My father noted this in a logbook he'd started. "Photosensitivity affecting motor control," he wrote. "Possible retinal damage reducing coordination in daylight. Night movement more fluid, more dangerous." He was studying them. Of course he was. Richard Voss didn't panic. He documented. The group settled into uneasy routine. My father had created a schedule, posted on the wall in laminated sheets with dry erase markers for adjustments. Sleep shifts, meal times, exercise periods, maintenance tasks. It was rigid, but not cruel. Structured, but not suffocating. Tom embraced it immediately. His engineer's brain craved order. Frank resisted on principle, but complied after the second day when he realized that without structure, the hours dissolved into a formless dread that was far worse than any schedule. I was assigned water system maintenance and exterior camera monitoring. Every 4 hours, I checked the feeds. 7 cameras covering a 360-degree view of the property and the road beyond. I watched the world decay in 4-hour increments. On day 2, a car drove past at high speed, horn blaring, swerving. It didn't stop. On day 3, smoke rose from somewhere east, a thick column that lasted 9 hours before dissipating. On day 4, nothing moved except them. Joyce became the group's medical resource by default. She'd been a veterinary technician before the outbreak, which wasn't human medicine, but was closer than anyone else could claim. She inventoried our medical supplies with Tom's help. Antibiotics, painkillers, bandages, antiseptic, suture kits, antihistamines. No surgical capability, she told my father. If someone needs more than stitches, I can't help them. Then no one gets hurt, my father replied, as if injury was a matter of discipline. Lena handled food preparation and rationing calculations. She'd always been the mathematician in the family, a data analyst in her civilian life. She built a spreadsheet on paper that tracked caloric intake per person, projected consumption rates, and estimated our window before supplies became critical. 8 months is optimistic, she told me quietly on day 4. 6.5 is realistic. 5 if someone gets sick and needs extra nutrition. Devin was the hardest variable. A 12-year-old in a bunker with 8 adults, no school, no friends, no sunlight. Sandra tried to maintain normalcy, reading with him, having him help with small tasks, keeping a routine within the routine. But he grew quieter each day. His eyes developed a flatness that concerned me. He'd stare at the concrete walls with an expression I couldn't decode. Not fear, not sadness, something more like absence. He's dissociating, Joyce told Sandra gently on day 5. It's a protective mechanism. Give him purpose, something that's his responsibility. My father assigned Devin the plant lights. He'd installed a small hydroponic system in the back corner of the supply room, lettuce, herbs, tomatoes. Devin became their caretaker. He measured water levels, adjusted light timers, noted growth. It wasn't much, but it gave him something alive to tend. And that mattered more than any of us could have predicted. Frank paced. That was his primary activity for the first week, pacing the length of the main corridor, back and forth, his boots making a rhythmic sound against the concrete that became the background noise of our underground life. He didn't talk much. The shame sat on him like a physical weight. On day 6, Frank broke his silence. We were sitting at the table after dinner, canned soup, crackers, reconstituted orange drink. And he put his hands flat on the surface and said, "I need to apologize to everyone here." The table went quiet. Sandra looked up from helping Devin with a crossword puzzle. Tom paused mid-sip of his water. My father sat at the head of the table with his logbook open, pen in hand. "I spent years making fun of this place," Frank continued. "Years making Richard feel like a fool. Years telling anyone who'd listen that my brother had lost his mind." His voice cracked slightly. Frank, who never showed vulnerability, who armored himself in humor and dismissal. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry. To Richard. To all of you. Because if he'd listened to me, if he'd let the jokes get to him and stopped building, we'd be up there right now." My father set his pen down. He looked at his brother with an expression I'd never seen before. Something soft and raw that he usually kept buried beneath his engineering precision. "Frank," he said, "you're here. That's what matters." "It's not enough." "It is." My father's tone held finality. "We move forward. That's the only direction that exists now." Frank nodded, pressed his lips together, and said nothing else. But something shifted in the group after that moment. The air pressure changed. We weren't 9 strangers trapped together anymore. We were 9 people who'd chosen, however imperfectly, to trust each other. The apology wasn't just for my father. It was permission for all of us to release the small, petty weights we'd been carrying, the resentments, the doubts, the embarrassment of needing help from someone we'd dismissed. Day 7 brought the first real test. The motion sensors triggered at 3:17 a.m. Not a single ping, but a continuous alarm. I was on camera duty. I switched to the north-facing feed and felt my stomach drop. There were at least 30 of them, moving in a loose cluster along the road, drawn by something, sound, scent, electromagnetic impulse we didn't know. They moved past our property line, their shapes gray and jerking in the infrared camera view. One broke from the group and walked toward the house above us. It reached the front door, pressed against it, and stayed there, pushing with a steady, mindless force. I woke my father. He came to the monitor, studied the feed for 40 seconds, then said, "The house will hold. The bunker entrance is concealed. They don't know we're here." "How can you be sure?" "Because I built the entrance to be invisible from above. The bulkhead doors are covered by the garden shed structure. The ventilation outlet is disguised as a drain pipe. The cameras are pinhole. There's nothing to attract attention." He was right. The infected figure pressed against the house for 11 minutes, then wandered away to rejoin the group. They passed through Colton like a slow river, and by dawn, the road was empty again. But the event changed something in all of us. The bunker had felt impenetrable before. Now it felt like what it was: a container buried in the ground, surrounded by something that wanted in. Sandra asked my father that morning, "What if they find the entrance?" "The bulkhead doors are reinforced steel with hydraulic locks. Even if they found them, they lack the coordination to operate mechanisms. They push, they don't think." "But what if there are hundreds, thousands, enough weight to—" "The doors are rated for 800 pounds of lateral force and 1,200 pounds of downward force. I over-engineered everything by a factor of 3. He said this calmly, factually. The concrete is 16 inches thick with rebar reinforcement. This structure would survive a direct vehicle impact. Sandra nodded, but I saw her hand find Devin's shoulder and squeeze. Trust is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. And even with my father's engineering certainty, none of us could place our faith entirely in concrete and steel when what lurked above us defied every natural law we'd grown up believing. Day 9 introduced a problem my father hadn't engineered a solution for: people. Tom and Frank had a confrontation over water usage. It began small. Frank taking a longer drink at the dispenser, refilling his cup a second time, then a third. Tom tracked consumption with the same precision he applied to every system in the bunker. He approached Frank after breakfast with a clipboard. "You've used 40% more than your allocation 3 days running." Frank bristled immediately. "Are you counting my sips now, Tom?" "I'm tracking resource consumption. It's my assignment." "Your assignment is to monitor the system, not police people. The system includes people. If one person exceeds their allocation consistently, the timeline shortens for everyone." Frank stood up from his bunk, his jaw tight. "So what do you want me to do? Dehydrate? I'm a big guy. I need more water than your spreadsheet says." My father intervened before it escalated. He recalculated Frank's allocation based on body mass and activity level, increased it by 15%, and adjusted the overall timeline accordingly. The conflict dissolved, technically, but the residue remained. Tom watched Frank differently after that. Frank made a point of drinking slowly, deliberately, in Tom's line of sight. Small acts of defiance that accumulated like sediment. I recognized the pattern from every group dynamic study I'd ever read. Confined space, limited resources, uncertain duration, life or death stakes. The recipe for interpersonal erosion. My father's schedule and systems could manage logistics, but they couldn't manage ego, resentment, or the primal discomfort of being dependent on others for survival. Lena pulled me aside that afternoon. We stood in the corridor between the main chamber and the supply room, the only semi-private space available. "Eli, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to react visibly." "Okay." "Joyce is pregnant. 8 weeks. We found out 2 days before everything happened. We were going to tell the family at dinner next month." Her eyes were steady but rimmed with fear. "We haven't told anyone here. We don't know how to. We don't know what it means for—" She gestured broadly at the concrete walls, the fluorescent lights, the world we now inhabited. I processed this in layers. Joy, because Lena had wanted this for years, had gone through 2 rounds of IVF terror. Because a pregnant woman in a bunker with limited medical supplies and a veterinary technician as the closest thing to a doctor was not a scenario any obstetrician would endorse. Pragmatism, because this changed our resource calculations, our timeline, everything. You have to tell Dad, I said. I know, I'm going to, tonight. And Joyce needs more nutrition, starting now. Lena, the prenatal care. I know, Eli, I know. Her voice tightened. I know what we don't have. I hugged my sister in that narrow corridor, with the hum of filtered air above us. And I felt the weight of what this world was becoming. A child was coming into existence, while the world above ended. There was something mythic in that, something ancient and terrible and beautiful. But mythology doesn't deliver babies safely. Medicine does. And we had a woman who'd spent her career with animals. That evening, Lena told my father. He received the news with characteristic stillness, nodded twice, then immediately opened his logbook and began revising supply calculations. We need to reallocate protein, he said. And calories. Joyce needs a minimum of 2,300 calories daily from now on. I'll adjust the rationing framework tonight. Dad, Lena said, say something human. He looked up at her, set the pen down, and then, something I hadn't seen since I was very young, his eyes went glassy. I'm going to be a grandfather, he said. The words came out rough, barely audible. He stood and pulled Lena into an embrace that lasted longer than any hug I'd ever witnessed from Richard Voss. When he released her, he picked the pen back up and returned to his calculations. Love and logistics, inseparable. That was my father's language. Day 11 brought voices from outside. Not the groaning, toneless sounds the infected made. Actual voices. Human speech, muffled by 16 inches of concrete and 6 feet of packed earth, but unmistakable. I was on camera duty when I saw them. 3 people moving up the road toward our property. 2 men and a woman. They carried backpacks and moved with deliberate caution, checking over their shoulders every few steps. The woman held a hunting rifle. 1 man limped badly. They stopped at the end of our driveway. The woman pointed at the house, at the garden shed specifically. My stomach clenched. Could they know? Had they seen my father building the entrance years ago? Were they neighbors I didn't recognize? I woke my father. He studied the camera feed with unblinking focus. I don't know them, he said. They're not from Colton. They're pointing at the shed. They might just be looking for shelter. The house looks intact. We watched them approach the front door of the house above us. The woman tried the handle, locked. One of the men broke a window with his elbow. They climbed inside. Through the interior cameras my father had placed throughout the house, cameras I hadn't known existed, we watched them move through rooms, opening cabinets, searching for food. There's nothing up there, my father said. I moved everything useful down here years ago. The strangers spent 20 minutes in the house. They found nothing. The woman kicked a cabinet door in frustration. They sat in the living room, exhausted. The limping man examined his ankle, swollen, probably sprained. The other man stood at the window, watching the road with the same vigilance we all now wore permanently. We should help them, I said. My father didn't respond immediately. He studied the feed, his jaw working slightly. The only outward sign of internal conflict I could identify. We have supplies for 9 people for 6 months, he said carefully. 12 would reduce that to 4 months, possibly less if medical needs increase. His eyes flicked to me. He was thinking about Joyce, about the pregnancy, about the narrowing margins. Dad, they're people. So are we. The silence between those two statements contained the entire moral landscape of survival. I understood his position intellectually. I rejected it emotionally. But emotion doesn't extend supply timelines. And my father had spent 17 years thinking in timelines. Tom joined us at the monitors. He watched for a moment, then said, "What if they find the entrance?" "They won't," my father said. "The shed access looks like a root cellar door covered by plywood and garden equipment. Even if they move the equipment, the hydraulic mechanism requires a keypad code. And if they start making noise up there, attracting more infected?" That was the real concern. The three strangers were now a liability regardless of whether we helped them. Their presence in the house above us created sound, heat signatures, human indicators that could draw the infected toward our location. Every hour they stayed was an hour of increased risk. Lena appeared behind us. She'd heard the conversation. "We can't just watch them on a screen and do nothing, Dad. That's not who we are." "Who we are is alive," my father replied. "I want to keep it that way." The argument continued. Quiet, intense, fundamental. Frank, who joined midway through, sided with me and Lena. Sandra sided with my father, her hand on Devin's back, her maternal calculus overriding broader morality. Tom abstained. Joyce listened from her bunk, one hand resting on her stomach. My father made the decision at noon. "I'll open the upper access, bring them food and water, but I won't reveal the bunker. I won't invite them in. They get supplies for 3 days and directions to the nearest town. That's what I can offer without compromising us." It was a compromise I hated. It was also the most generous thing I'd ever seen my father do, because every can of food he gave away was a day subtracted from his grandchild's future. My father went up alone. He used the secondary exit, a narrow tunnel that emerged 50 yards from the house behind a false rock formation he'd constructed from concrete and fiberglass. I watched on the cameras as he appeared at the back of the property, circled to the front, and knocked on his own door. The strangers startled. The woman raised her rifle. My father stood with his hands visible, palms forward, and spoke words I couldn't hear. The exterior microphones only captured fragments. "Live nearby, saw you enter. Have some supplies." The woman lowered the rifle slowly. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. My father handed them a bag he'd prepared. 8 cans of food, 6 water bottles, a basic first aid kit, and a hand-drawn map showing the route to Estacada, where the radio had mentioned a National Guard presence days earlier. The strangers took the supplies with visible gratitude. The limping man shook my father's hand. The woman said something that made my father nod once. His acknowledgement gesture, the closest he came to expressed emotion with strangers. They left within the hour, heading east on the road. I watched them disappear on the cameras, 3 small figures moving through a dead landscape. The woman checked behind them every few steps. The limping man fell behind twice. They didn't look back at our house. My father returned through the secondary entrance, sealed it behind him, and sat down at the table without speaking. He opened his logbook and adjusted the supply calculations. 8 cans removed, 6 water bottles subtracted. The numbers mattered to him, not because he was cold, but because precision was his form of devotion. Every number represented a day of safety for the people he loved. "You did the right thing," I told him. "I did a thing," he replied. Whether it was right depends on what happens next. What happened next was day 12. The motion sensors erupted at 4 a.m. Continuous, cascading, every zone triggering in sequence. I scrambled to the monitors. The cameras showed a horde. Not 30 this time, not 50, hundreds. A river of infected bodies flowing down the road, pressing through yards, pushing against structures. They moved with a unified direction, east. The same direction we'd sent the strangers. "Sound," my father said behind me. He was already awake, already dressed. I wondered if he'd slept at all. Something east drew them. Gunshot, vehicle, horn, something loud enough to create a migration pattern. The horde passed through Colton like floodwater. Fences broke, windows shattered from accumulated pressure. The infected didn't attack the structures deliberately. They simply pushed forward, and anything in their path gave way. Our house above took damage. The front porch collapsed under the weight of bodies pressing against it. The living room window broke inward. Several infected entered the house, wandered through rooms, knocked over furniture, pressed against walls. One stood in the kitchen directly above the main chamber. Through 16 inches of concrete, I could hear it. A faint, rhythmic thumping as it moved against the kitchen island. Devin woke up. Sandra held him. Joyce gripped Lena's hand. Frank stood rigid against the far wall, his face white. Tom checked the structural integrity monitors, screens my father had installed showing stress levels on the bunker's ceiling. "We're fine," my father said. His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who knew his own construction. "They cannot get through. They don't know we're here. They'll pass." They passed. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of muffled sounds, of vibrations through the concrete, of knowing that death walked above us separated by engineering and foresight. When the motion sensors finally fell silent, I pulled up the cameras. The surface looked like a disaster zone. The house was damaged, but standing. The garden shed, our primary entrance, was intact. The false rock formation concealing the secondary exit was untouched. My father had built for this. Not theoretically, specifically. "How did you know?" I asked him. "How did you know it would be like this?" "I didn't know specifics," he said. "I knew margins. I built past them." Day 14 marked the halfway point of our second week, and the group was changing in ways I could measure by observation alone. Frank had stopped pacing. He'd taken over daily exercise coordination, leading the group through 30-minute sessions of bodyweight movements in the main chamber, adapting the routine to the confined space. He was surprisingly good at it. His natural humor, which had been dormant since arrival, emerged in the exercise sessions as gentle encouragement and self-deprecating commentary. "Come on, Tom. My grandmother could do more push-ups, and she's been dead for 12 years. It wasn't hilarious, but it made people smile, and smiles had become a scarce resource. Tom had grown quieter. He maintained his systems, water, ventilation, power, with mechanical reliability, but he withdrew from group conversation. He ate alone when possible, slept facing the wall, responded to questions with minimal syllables. I recognized the signs from my own experience with depression years earlier. The slow retraction from connection, the preference for tasks over people, the gradual dimming. I mentioned it to Joyce. "He's grieving," she said. "His wife is in Portland. His daughter is in San Francisco. He doesn't know if they're alive." Tom had never mentioned a family. I realized I'd never asked. In 2 weeks of shared confinement, I'd learned nothing about him beyond his function in our group. The shame of that oversight sat heavy in my chest. I approached him during his maintenance round. He was checking the water filtration gauges, 3 pressure readings he logged every 6 hours. "Tom, can I help?" "No." "Can I sit with you while you work?" He paused, looked at me over his shoulder. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. "If you want." I sat on an overturned bucket and watched him work. After 10 minutes of silence, he said, "Her name is Margaret, my wife. She was visiting our daughter when this started." Another pause. "I called her. The day Richard called me. I called her and told her to find shelter. She said she would. That was the last I heard." There's no reason to think anything, Eli. That's the problem. The absence of information is its own kind of torture. He adjusted a valve. "I come down here and I'm useful. I check the systems and they respond predictably. Pressure goes up, I adjust. Filter clogs, I clean. It's controllable." He looked at me directly. "Up there, nothing is controllable. And the people I love are in that uncontrollable space." I had no comfort to offer that wasn't hollow. So I sat with him and said nothing, and hoped that presence itself was enough. Meanwhile, the pregnancy had become communal knowledge. Joyce's nausea intensified during week 2. Audible in the shared sleeping space, impossible to hide. Sandra figured it out first, then Frank, then Tom. Each responded differently. By it, Sandra became fiercely protective, adjusting Joyce's sleeping area, insisting she take the bottom bunk, preparing her meals separately with extra protein. Frank made a single joke about underground baby, and then reading the room, never mentioned it again. Tom said nothing, but began factoring a 10th person into his resource calculations without being asked. My father had already planned ahead. He showed me a section of his original bunker blueprints, a partitioned area he'd designated Medical Bay that currently served as additional storage. "We'll clear it by month 4, he said. "Joyce will need privacy and space. The birth will happen here." "With what medical support?" I asked. "Joyce is trained in mammalian labor and delivery. The mechanics are the same across species. We have sterile supplies, clean water, and 7 people to assist." He said this as if delivering a human baby in an underground bunker during an apocalypse was a logistics problem rather than a terrifying prospect. "And if something goes wrong?" His pen stopped. The pause lasted 3 seconds, an eternity for Richard Voss. "Then we'll face that when it comes." It was the first time I'd ever heard him acknowledge a problem he hadn't already solved. Day 16 brought the sound that changed everything. Not from outside, from within. A sharp metallic groan from the ventilation system, followed by silence. Complete silence. The omnipresent hum that had become our ambient baseline, the sound of filtered air circulating, of safety made audible, stopped. My father was at the system in under a minute. Tom was with him in 2. They opened the maintenance panel together, working with the synchronized precision of men who spoke the same technical language. The rest of us stood in the main chamber, suddenly aware of the air, of its finite nature, of the fact that we were sealed underground with a limited oxygen supply if the ventilation failed. "Motor burnout," Tom said. "Primary circulation fan. The backup should have engaged." He traced wires with his fingers. "Backup relay is stuck. Corroded contact point." My father retrieved a toolbox from beneath his bunk, a specific toolbox labeled HVAC emergency, containing exactly the tools and parts needed for this scenario. He'd prepared for this. Of course he had. But preparation and execution are different things when the air you're breathing is non-renewable. How long do we have without circulation? Sandra asked. Her voice was controlled, but her hand gripped Devon's shoulder with visible pressure. At our oxygen consumption rate, approximately 6 hours before CO2 levels become dangerous, Tom said. 3 hours before symptoms begin. Headache, confusion, impaired judgment. Then fix it in less than 3 hours, Frank said, an edge of hysteria in his attempt at humor. My father and Tom worked. They disassembled the relay mechanism, cleaned the corroded contacts with fine grit sandpaper from the emergency kit, reassembled. The backup fan engaged with a shudder and a whine that was different from the primary, higher-pitched, slightly irregular, but functional. Air moved. We breathed. Primary fan needs a replacement motor, Tom said, wiping his hands on his pants. Do we have one? My father nodded. Parts cabinet 3, shelf 2. But installation requires shutting down the entire system for 45 minutes. We'll need to open the surface vent manually to maintain oxygen flow during the swap. Opening the surface vent meant creating a potential entry point. It meant risk. It meant trusting that nothing above us would find the opening in 45 minutes. My father weighed this silently, staring at the ventilation access panel as if he could solve the equation through sheer concentration. We wait for a clear surface read, he decided. Cameras show nothing moving within visual range. We do the swap, not before. We waited 11 hours. The backup fan whined and stuttered but held. Devon fell asleep with his head on his mother's lap. Frank played solitaire. Lena reviewed her food calculations with Joyce, adjusting for the nutritional requirements of the second trimester. I watched the cameras with a focus that bordered on obsession, scanning for movement, waiting for the window. At 3 a.m., the cameras showed nothing. No motion for 6 consecutive hours. My father made the call. He and Tom climbed to the ventilation access, a vertical shaft with built-in ladder rungs leading to the surface vent. They opened the external grill remotely, then shut down the primary system. For 45 minutes, our air came directly from outside, unfiltered, carrying whatever the surface held. We breathed it and hoped. Tom worked fast. My father handed him tools. The motor swap took 37 minutes. When the new motor engaged, the familiar hum returned, deeper, steadier than before, and the sound of it triggered something emotional in me that I didn't expect. Relief so profound, it manifested as physical weakness. My knees buckled slightly. I grabbed the wall. We were so fragile, all of us. All of this. One motor, one corroded contact, one stuck relay between survival and suffocation. My father's preparation had saved us. His foresight in storing replacement parts, his knowledge of the system, his calm under pressure. But the margin had narrowed. The backup fan was now our only backup. If it failed before we could source another, we'd have 45 minutes of surface air or death. My father logged the incident in his book. 3 pages, every detail. Because next time, if there was a next time, the solution needed to be faster. Day 17. Frank came to me with something unexpected. He sat beside me at the monitoring station, my shift 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., and placed a folded piece of paper on the console. "What is this?" I asked. "A letter. To Richard. In case something happens to me." I looked at him. Nothing's going to happen. "Eli." His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being realistic. 9 people in a box. Things happen. Medical emergencies, mental breaks, accidents. I want him to know what I should have said while I had decades to say it." I took the letter. I didn't read it. It wasn't mine to read. But I held it and understood what Frank was doing. He was settling accounts. Not because he expected to die, but because proximity to death had made him unwilling to leave debts unpaid. Should I hold on to it? Keep it somewhere I can't retrieve it on a whim, Frank said with a slight smile. Otherwise, I'll convince myself it's too sentimental and throw it away. I put the letter inside my pillowcase, a strange place but private. That same day, Sandra made a request that surprised everyone. She asked my father if Devon could go outside. The table went silent. My father set down his fork slowly. Sandra. Not far, not for long, 10 minutes, the backyard. He hasn't seen the sky in 17 days, Richard. He's 12 years old. His body needs sunlight for vitamin D. His mind needs open space. He's shutting down. She wasn't wrong. Devon had become nearly nonverbal over the past week. He tended his plants mechanically, but no longer showed interest in their growth. He slept 14 hours a day. He'd stopped making eye contact. The surface is not secure, my father said. The cameras show nothing has moved in the area for 36 hours. The horde went east. You said yourself they follow sound. If we're quiet. Sandra, I cannot guarantee safety above ground. You can't guarantee it down here either. Yesterday, we almost ran out of air. Her voice sharpened. My son is disappearing, Richard, right in front of me. And I won't watch it happen because we're too afraid to open a door. The argument extended for an hour. Lena supported Sandra. Joyce expressed concern about infection risk, not from the dead, but from the possibility of airborne pathogens if the infection had a respiratory component. Tom suggested a compromise. The secondary exit, which opened onto a sheltered area behind the rock formation, surrounded by dense tree cover. 5 minutes. 1 adult escort. Visual confirmation of clear surroundings. My father agreed to this modified version with visible reluctance. Tomorrow, dawn. I'll escort him personally. 5 minutes maximum. We maintain visual contact with cameras throughout. Sandra nodded. The tension in her shoulders released fractionally. Devon, when told, showed the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in days. Not quite a smile, but a lifting of the facial muscles that had been slack with disconnection. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk and listened to the hum of the new ventilation motor and thought about what we were becoming down here. We were safe. Technically, mechanically, engineeringly safe. But safety without living isn't survival. It's storage. My father understood systems perfectly. But he was learning, we all were, that human beings can't be optimized like water pressure or airflow. We need things that don't fit on spreadsheets. Sunlight, touch, open sky, purpose beyond persistence. I thought about the child growing inside Joyce. What world would they enter? Would they ever see the surface? Would they know what trees looked like beyond the hydroponic lettuce in the corner? These thoughts spiraled and multiplied until I recognized them as unproductive. But I couldn't stop. The ceiling pressed down, the concrete walls pressed in. And for the first time in 17 days, I felt what Devon had been feeling all along, the slow, crushing realization that this box might be the rest of our lives. Dawn on day 18. My father woke Devon gently, a hand on his shoulder, a quiet word. The boy's eyes opened instantly, alert in a way he hadn't been for days. He'd slept in his shoes. He'd been ready for hours. The group gathered at the secondary exit. My father wore his boots and carried nothing except a flashlight and a crowbar. Devon stood beside him, vibrating with contained energy. Sandra hugged her son, whispered something in his ear, then stepped back and positioned herself at the camera monitor. I watched from the screens as my father opened the false rock formation and climbed out into the pre-dawn gray. He scanned the surroundings. Trees, underbrush, the slope leading up to the property. Clear. He reached back and helped Devin up. The boy stood in the open air for the first time in 18 days. On camera, I watched his shoulders drop. His head tilted back. His chest expanded with a breath that I imagined tasted like oxygen from another planet. The trees were still. Mist hung in the low areas. A bird, a single bird, called from somewhere in the canopy. Devin's hand reached out and touched a tree trunk, his fingers pressing into the bark as if confirming its reality. My father stood 3 feet away, crowbar at his side, eyes moving constantly. He gave Devin 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then his hand found the boy's shoulder, gently guided him back toward the entrance. Devin didn't resist. He'd gotten what he needed, a reminder that the world still existed beyond concrete. They descended, the entrance sealed. Devin walked past all of us without speaking, went to his bunk, and slept for 3 hours. When he woke, he went directly to his plants, spoke to them softly, the first words he'd uttered in days, and began carefully pruning the tomato seedlings that had grown leggy in the artificial light. Sandra cried in the corridor. Quiet, controlled, private. I saw her but didn't intrude. Some grief needs witnesses, some needs solitude. Day 18 continued with an event none of us anticipated. The radio, which my father checked every 6 hours at prescribed intervals, picked up a new signal. Not the automated emergency broadcast, not the woman from the Willamette Valley. A man's voice, clear and measured, broadcasting on a frequency reserved for amateur operators. This is Station Bravo, Camp Ridgeline. If you are receiving this transmission, we are a fortified settlement of approximately 400 survivors located in the Cascade Range. Grid reference. He gave coordinates. We have medical facilities, agricultural capacity, and defensive infrastructure. We are accepting new arrivals through the Southern Access Road. Identification and health screening required. Repeat. Station Bravo, Camp Ridgeline. The message looped. My father recorded the coordinates on his map, a topographic chart of Oregon he'd mounted on the supply room wall. Camp Ridgeline was 53 miles northeast of Colton, through mountain terrain, with infected between here and there. The room divided instantly. Frank wanted to go. 400 people, Richard. Medical facilities, agriculture. That's a future, not just a delay. My father's face was unreadable. We don't know if it's real. We don't know if it's safe. We don't know if the route is survivable. We don't know anything, Frank pressed. But we know this bunker has a shelf life. 6 months, maybe less with the baby coming. What happens when the food runs out? I planned for resupply missions. When? Into what? You saw the horde. You saw what's up there. Resupply from where? The argument was legitimate. Both positions held weight. My father had built a fortress, but a fortress without supply lines is a tomb. Camp Ridgeline, if real, offered something the bunker couldn't. Longevity, community, medical care for Joyce and the baby. A future measured in years rather than months. But 53 miles through infected territory with a pregnant woman, a traumatized child, and 9 people who'd never fired a weapon. The mathematics of that journey terrified me. We don't decide today, my father said. We verify, we listen, we plan. And when we move, if we move, we do it with precision. The next 4 days became a study in preparation and debate. My father listened to the Camp Ridgeline broadcast every 6 hours, recording variations, timing intervals, noting when the signal was strongest. Tom mapped potential routes using the topographic chart. 3 options ranging from 53 miles on direct terrain to 71 miles following roads that might be clearer but more exposed. The group fractured along predictable lines. Frank argued for immediate departure. His restlessness had found purpose. He couldn't pace the corridor anymore without feeling like a caged animal. Every day we wait, we use supplies we'll need for the journey. Every day we wait, that camp might fill up, shut its doors, or fall. Sandra surprised me by supporting him. Devin can't stay down here indefinitely. None of us can. The ventilation failure proved how close we are to disaster at any moment. I'd rather take a calculated risk than wait for the next system failure. My father, Tom, and Joyce advocated for caution. Joyce's pregnancy made her conservative. The physical demands of a 50-mile hike through mountainous terrain at 13 weeks pregnant were not trivial. Tom's engineering mind recoiled from the uncertainty. And my father didn't want to leave the bunker he'd spent 17 years building. I understood that. This structure wasn't just a shelter. It was his life's work, his vindication, his love made manifest in concrete and steel. Lena and I occupied the middle ground, torn between safety and stagnation. We discussed it in the corridor late at night, voices barely above whispers. "If the radio's real," Lena said, "it's the only option that gives Joyce and the baby a genuine chance. I can't deliver a child down here with a veterinary technician and a prayer. And if the radio isn't real, if it's a trap, if we get halfway there then at least we tried. Eli, I've run the numbers 6 ways. The food lasts 5 months with current consumption and Joyce's increased needs. 5 months. Then what? We starve in a box Dad built to save us?" She was right. The bunker saved us in the acute phase, the collapse, the hordes, the initial chaos. But it was never designed to be permanent. My father had always planned for phase 2. Resupply, surface farming, gradual reintegration. Phase 2 assumed the infected would thin out, die off, become manageable. Nothing we'd observed supported that assumption. On day 20, my father called a formal meeting. All 9 of us around the table, the map spread in the center, 3 routes marked in different colors. He stood at the head, not commanding, but organizing. "I've verified the broadcast pattern," he said. "It's consistent, professionally structured, and includes tactical details that suggest legitimate military involvement. Grid references, access protocols, screening procedures. This is not a random survivor with a radio. This is organized infrastructure." Frank leaned forward. "So we go." "Let me finish. The shortest route crosses 2 major road corridors and a river. Both corridors showed heavy infected movement during the horde migration. The river crossing requires either a bridge, exposed, possibly damaged, or a ford that adds 8 miles. The medium route follows Forest Service roads through higher elevation terrain, less infected presence based on what we know about their movement patterns, but more physically demanding. The longest route follows the highway system partially and exposes us to maximum risk of encounter. "Route 2, Tom said. "Higher elevation, forest cover, reduced contact probability." My father nodded. "That's my assessment as well. 61 miles. At a pace adjusted for Joyce's condition and Devin's endurance, I estimate 5 days. We'd need to carry supplies for 7, 2 days of margin." "When?" Sandra asked. My father looked at the table, at his logbook, at the walls he'd built with his own hands. 3 days. We used that time to prepare packs, plan rest points, establish contingencies. He paused. And to say goodbye to this place. No one spoke. The weight of his words filled the room like water. The acknowledgement that leaving meant abandoning the only certainty any of us had. The preparation days were a blur of purpose. My father operated with the precision of a man executing a plan he'd hoped would never be necessary, but had designed nonetheless. He distributed supplies into 9 backpacks, weight adjusted for each person's capacity. Joyce carried the lightest load. Frank and I carried the heaviest. Devin's pack contained only his personal items and water, everything else distributed among the adults. Tom prepared emergency medical kits for each pack. Basic supplies duplicated across multiple carriers so that if one person became separated or lost their pack, the group retained capability. Bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, water purification tablets. Joyce added veterinary-grade antibiotics and a suture kit to her own pack, along with sterile gloves and a small bottle of betadine. Lena created a navigation system. Photocopies of relevant topographic map sections sealed in plastic bags, distributed to 3 people. My father, Tom, and me. If we separated, each subgroup could navigate independently. Frank undertook a task I hadn't considered. Weapons. My father's bunker contained no firearms. He'd never been a gun owner, and Oregon law complicated underground weapons storage. But Frank had brought a hunting knife and a hatchet. My father's tools provided crowbars, a hammer, and a compact hand axe. These were distributed among the adults with instructions that were simple and brutal. Aim for the head. Don't swing unless you must. Running is always preferable to fighting. Sandra prepared Devin differently. She sat with him on his bunk and spoke to him with a directness I admired. We're leaving tomorrow morning. We're going to a camp where there are other people, doctors, food, safety. The walk is long, and it might be scary. But you are going to stay with me, and you're going to be brave. And we are going to make it, Devin nodded. Can I bring a tomato plant? Sandra looked at the hydroponics setup. The small green lives Devin had tended for 3 weeks. Her face worked through several emotions before settling on gentle resolution. You can bring seeds. We'll grow new ones at the camp. Devin harvested seeds from the most mature plant with careful, practiced fingers. He sealed them in a small plastic bag and placed them in his jacket pocket, zipping it closed with deliberation. Something about that gesture, a 12-year-old saving seeds from an underground garden to plant in an unknown future, struck me as the most hopeful thing I'd witnessed since the world fell apart. That night, our last night in the bunker, was strange and tender. We ate well. My father opened reserve supplies he'd been hoarding, canned peaches, chocolate bars, instant coffee. It felt like a celebration and a funeral simultaneously. We sat around the table longer than usual. Frank told stories from his and my father's childhood, stories I'd never heard, about 2 brothers growing up in rural Maine, building forts in the woods, catching frogs in the creek behind their house. My father smiled at these memories, with an expression that softened his face into someone I barely recognized. Tom spoke about Margaret, more than he ever had. Their first date, the way she laughed, how she'd call him at work just to tell him something funny the cat did. His voice cracked but didn't break. We listened without interrupting because listening was the only gift available. Joyce and Lena talked about names. They'd been considering Elijah or Ruth, names that carried weight, that meant something. Elijah for you, Lena told me, if it's a boy. I looked away because the emotion was too large for the confined space. At midnight, my father stood. He looked at each of us individually, a slow, deliberate gaze that landed on every face. "This structure saved your lives," he said. "It did what I built it to do. Tomorrow we leave it because survival requires more than shelter. It requires future. Sleep well." He turned off the main lights. The emergency strips along the floor cast the bunker in a soft blue glow. I lay in my bunk and listened to the hum of the ventilation one last time. My father's heartbeat, steady and reliable, and soon to be left behind. Day 22. Dawn. My father sealed the bunker at 5:47 a.m. with a sequence of actions that took 12 minutes. He shut down non-essential systems, set the ventilation to maintenance mode, locked the supply room, activated the automated security protocols that would keep the cameras recording and the motion sensors logging. He left the door code unchanged. "If we need to come back," he said, "it'll be here." I watched him seal the hydraulic doors from outside, the first time those doors had closed with all of us on the surface since the world ended. The mechanisms engaged with their familiar precision. Steel bolts slid into brackets. The garden shed structure concealed the entrance, as it always had. My father stood over it for a moment, one hand resting on the wooden frame, his fingers tracing a grain line in the lumber. Then he turned and walked toward the tree line where the group waited. 9 people, 9 backpacks, a hand-drawn map, and 61 miles of unknown territory between us and something that might be salvation. The forest swallowed us within minutes. My father took point. He knew this terrain from decades of living adjacent to it. Tom walked rear guard. The rest of us filled the middle in a loose column with Devin and Sandra near the center, Joyce flanked by Lena and me. Frank moved between positions, restless even in motion, his hatchet hanging from a belt loop. The first 3 hours were almost peaceful. The forest was quiet. Bird calls, wind in the canopy, the soft compression of pine needles under boots. We climbed steadily, gaining elevation as we moved northeast along a Forest Service road my father had identified on the map. The infected tended toward lower elevations, toward population centers, toward roads and noise. Up here, the world felt untouched, as if the apocalypse was something that happened below us. In a separate reality we'd simply climbed above. Joyce set our pace, steady, manageable, with a rest stop every 45 minutes. She showed no outward signs of difficulty, but Lena watched her with an attentiveness that spoke of deeper concern. The first trimester's nausea had mostly passed, replaced by a fatigue that Joyce managed through sheer will. She ate small amounts at each stop, nuts, dried fruit, energy bars. She drank water consistently. She was methodical in her self-care because she understood that she wasn't maintaining one body, but 2. Devin walked with surprising endurance. The sunlight seemed to restore something fundamental in him. Color returned to his face. His eyes tracked the environment with curiosity rather than absence. He pointed out a hawk circling above the ridge. He identified mushrooms growing on a fallen log. Inedible ones, he told his mother, which meant he'd been reading the foraging section of my father's survival library. Sandra nodded and squeezed his hand. And I saw her exhale fully for the first time in 3 weeks. We covered 9 miles by noon. My father estimated we'd manage 12 to 15 miles daily at this pace, meaning 4 to 5 days total. We stopped for lunch in a clearing surrounded by Douglas firs, eating canned meat and crackers while the forest buzzed with insect life. Everything felt deceptively normal. A family hiking trip, a camping excursion, except for the crowbars and the knowledge of what waited below. At 2 p.m., we encountered our first evidence of the outbreak's reach at altitude. A campsite, tent collapsed, sleeping bags torn, a cooler overturned with its contents scattered and rotting. Dark stains on the ground in a pattern that told a story I didn't want to read. My father examined it briefly, noting details in his logbook. "Several days old," he said. "They moved on. We keep going." But the campsite punctured our bubble of denial. The infection hadn't respected elevation. It had reached up here, found people, consumed them, or turned them. The peaceful forest was a stage set, not a sanctuary. We walked faster after that. Day 2 of travel. We'd camped overnight in a dense thicket my father selected for its concealment, surrounded by undergrowth, invisible from more than 10 feet away. Sleep came in shifts. 2 people awake at all times, watching, listening. I drew the 2 a.m. shift with Sandra. We sat back to back on a fallen log, surrounded by darkness so complete that the stars above the canopy seemed violent in their brightness. "Do you think they're there?" Sandra whispered. "The camp. Do you think it's real?" "My father thinks so. That's enough for me. Your father's been right about everything else." A pause. I judged him, Eli, for years. I smiled to his face and rolled my eyes behind his back. Everyone in the neighborhood did. He knows. He built the bunker anyway. That's what makes it worse. He knew we mocked him, and he still opened the door. I didn't respond because she wasn't looking for reassurance. She was processing the same guilt Frank had expressed weeks ago. The universal reckoning of people who dismissed preparedness as paranoia until preparedness saved their lives. Dawn brought fog. Thick, cold, disorienting. My father led us by compass, his pace unwavering despite visibility of less than 30 feet. We moved in tighter formation now, close enough to touch the person ahead. Devin held Sandra's jacket hem. Joyce held Lena's hand. The fog muffled sound, creating an acoustic environment where every snapped twig echoed disproportionately. At 9 a.m., we heard them. Not saw, heard. A sound that doesn't translate to description adequately. A wet, rhythmic vocalization, somewhere between breathing and moaning, coming from our left. Multiple sources. Close. My father raised his fist, the universal stop signal. 9 people froze simultaneously. Through the fog, shapes. Indistinct, moving perpendicular to our path. 5, maybe 7 figures, walking in the same loose cluster pattern we'd observed from the cameras. They moved slowly, daylight slowing them, fog apparently disorienting them as well. They hadn't detected us. They were 40 yards away, passing through the trees like ghosts. Devin's hand found Sandra's arm. His grip was white-knuckled, but he made no sound. My father waited, motionless, for 4 full minutes as the shapes drifted past. When the sounds faded, he waited another 2 minutes. Then he moved forward, adjusting our course slightly to angle away from the direction the infected had been traveling. We didn't speak for an hour after that encounter. The proximity, the reality of them existing in the same space we occupied, silenced us more effectively than any command. Frank's jaw was set so tight, I could see the muscles working. Tom moved with exaggerated care, placing each foot deliberately. Joyce breathed in a pattern I recognized as practiced calming technique. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. By midday, the fog burned off, and we could see again. My father paused at a ridgeline overlook, and we got our first clear view of the valley below. The town of Estacada was visible in the distance, or what remained of it. Smoke rose from several structures. No movement was discernible at this distance, but the roads leading in and out were clogged with vehicles, the frozen arteries of a dead civilization. That's where the National Guard perimeter was supposed to be, Tom said quietly. "It's not there anymore," my father replied. We looked at that vista and understood something collectively that none of us wanted to articulate. Whatever institutional response had been attempted, it had failed. The military, the government, the infrastructure of organized society, gone, consumed by the same thing that had eaten Colton. The only difference was scale. Camp Ridgeline was 42 miles ahead. 42 miles was all that separated us from either salvation or another ruin. We turned away from the overlook and continued northeast, climbing higher into the Cascades, leaving the dead valley behind us without ceremony or mourning, because mourning required energy we couldn't spare. My father's pace increased slightly, I noticed. He was worried too. Day 3 brought rain. Not a gentle Pacific Northwest drizzle, but a driving downpour that turned the Forest Service Road into a stream and reduced visibility to 20 feet. We pressed on because stopping meant extending our food supply timeline, and our margins were calculated to the day. Joyce stumbled on a slick route at mile 28. Lena caught her, arm around waist, immediate, protective. Joyce winced. "I'm fine," she said. Ankle turned slightly. She walked it off within 50 steps, but the incident heightened everyone's awareness of her vulnerability. She was carrying life inside her through conditions that challenged even the fittest among us. My father found a Forest Service cabin at mile 31. Abandoned, unlocked, structurally sound. He declared a rest stop. 2 hours, no more. We filed inside, dripping, shivering. Tom started a fire in the wood stove with materials from the cabin's own supply. The warmth was transcendent. Devin stood so close to the stove that Sandra had to pull him back. While we dried, my father reviewed the map. 29 miles remaining. 2 days if we maintain pace. The terrain climbs significantly in the next section, the approach to the Cascade Ridge, then descent into the valley where the camp should be. "Should be," Frank repeated. "Is," my father said firmly. "The broadcast continues. I checked this morning." Frank accepted this. We all did. Faith in that radio signal was the only fuel we had beyond calories. At mile 34, afternoon of day 3, we encountered survivors. Not infected. Humans, living, thinking, frightened humans. A group of 4. 2 women, a man, and a teenager. They emerged from the tree line ahead of us with weapons drawn. A shotgun, 2 knives, a baseball bat. We stopped, hands visible. "We're heading to Ridgeline," my father called out. "Camp Ridgeline, the radio broadcast." The tension held for 10 seconds. Then the man lowered his shotgun. "Us too," he said. "Been walking for 6 days from Salem." His name was Curtis. The women were his wife Elena and her sister Patricia. The teenager was Elena's son, Miguel. They'd survived the initial outbreak in a hardware store basement, less engineered than our bunker, but effective. When they heard the Ridgeline broadcast, they'd left immediately. They'd seen hordes. They'd lost people. Patricia's left arm was in a makeshift sling, broken, she said, from a fall while running. My father assessed them with characteristic efficiency. "Travel with us. 13 is harder to manage than 9, but there's safety in numbers if we're disciplined." Curtis agreed. We merged into a larger group. Awkward initially, but functional. Curtis knew the terrain ahead. He'd studied maps extensively and had already crossed the worst section. "The Ridge Pass is clear," he said. "We came through yesterday to scout ahead. No infected above 4,000 feet that we could find. They seem to prefer valley floors. Warmer maybe, more prey." This information was invaluable. It meant the final approach to Ridgeline, the highest elevation section, was likely the safest. My father recorded it in his logbook and adjusted our route slightly based on Curtis's intelligence. That night, 13 people camped in a grove of ancient cedars. We shared food, our canned goods, their foraged berries, and dried venison Curtis had prepared before leaving Salem. Devin and Miguel, close in age, sat together by the fire, speaking quietly. Devin showing Miguel the seeds in his pocket, Miguel nodding seriously, as if understanding their importance without explanation. Joyce slept deeply that night, the first uninterrupted sleep she'd managed since leaving the bunker. Lena stayed awake beside her, one hand resting on her partner's hip, watching the fire shadows move across the cedar trunks. I sat with my father on watch. He was alert, but calm, a quietness in him that I hadn't seen below ground. "Are you glad we left?" I asked. "I'm glad we have somewhere to go," he replied. "The bunker was survival. This is the part after survival." "What part is that?" "The part where you find out what survival was for." Day 5. The ridge pass opened before us at 8 a.m., a natural corridor through the mountain that Curtis had described accurately. Above us, clear sky. Below us, a valley extending northeast into a broad basin surrounded by peaks. And there, at the valley's center, visible as organized geometry against the wilderness, Camp Ridgeline. It was real. From this distance, I could make out structures, buildings, fencing, cleared land. Smoke rose from multiple points, but controlled smoke, chimneys, cooking fires, industry. Movement was visible. Tiny figures walking between structures with purpose and direction. The camp extended further than I'd imagined. Not a few tents and a radio antenna, but a genuine settlement. Infrastructure, community, life organized and continuing. My father stopped at the ridgeline and looked down at it for a long time. His face held an expression I'd never seen before, something between wonder and release. 17 years of preparation for the end of the world, and here was proof that the world could reconstitute itself, that his work, his bunker, his planning, his refusal to ignore the margins, had brought his family to this point, alive, together, arriving at a future he hadn't dared to engineer. The descent took 4 hours. The trail switched back down the mountain into the valley, passing through increasingly managed terrain. Trees cleared from certain areas, paths widened, directional markers nailed to trunks. Someone had prepared this approach. Someone had thought about incoming survivors and made the route navigable. At the valley floor, we reached a checkpoint. 2 people in military-style clothing stood behind a reinforced gate. Welded steel, vehicle barriers, sandbag positions. They were armed, but not aggressive. "How many?" one called out. 13, my father replied. "Any bites, injuries, symptoms?" "1 broken arm, 1 pregnancy. No bites, no symptoms." They opened the gate. A woman in a medical coat approached. Actual medical coat, stethoscope around her neck, clipboard in hand. "Welcome to Ridgeline. I'm Dr. Nair. Everyone gets screened before entry. Standard protocol, temperature, blood pressure, visual inspection. Takes about 20 minutes per person. 20 minutes per person. Organized, systematic, professional." Frank laughed. Not nervously, genuinely. A full laugh that came from somewhere deep, releasing pressure that had built for weeks. "Doomsday Dick did it," he said to no one in particular. He actually did it. My father didn't react to the name. He was watching Dr. Nair examine Devin. Gentle hands, kind voice, professional thoroughness. Sandra stood beside them, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched someone qualified care for her son. Joyce went next. Dr. Nair's expression shifted when she learned about the pregnancy. How far along? 13 weeks. We have an OB/GYN on staff. Qualified care for her son. Joyce went next. Dr. Nair's expression shifted when she learned about the pregnancy. How far along? 13 weeks. We have an OB/GYN on staff. Dr. Marcus Chen. He delivered 3 babies here already. She said this casually, as if delivering babies during the apocalypse was routine practice. Perhaps here it was. We passed screening in just over 3 hours. All 13 of us cleared. We entered Camp Ridgeline as the sun moved into late afternoon, casting long shadows across the settlement that now, impossibly, improbably, was home. My father walked through the camp slowly, observing everything. The water treatment facility, the greenhouse structures, the defensive perimeter, the communication tower. He nodded at each feature with the appreciation of an engineer recognizing competent work. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That evening, we ate in a communal dining hall. Fresh bread, actual vegetables, grown in those greenhouses. Protein from a livestock operation I could hear but not yet see. Devin ate 3 servings. Sandra led him. Frank sat beside my father and ate in companionable silence. I sat across from them and watched my family. Safe, fed, together. My sister and her partner, their unborn child now under real medical care. A traumatized boy eating fresh food in sunlight. 2 brothers sharing a table without the weight of years of mockery between them. An engineer whose foresight had carried 13 lives across the threshold between death and continuation. My father caught my eye across the table. He didn't smile, that wasn't his way. But he inclined his head slightly.